Hi, this is Taryn Grome, editor of Pharma Voice. We met with numerous inspirational thought leaders at this year's DIA annual conference as part of our Editors Take video series. I hope you enjoyed this discussion.
In this episode, Taryn meets with Eric Valentine, Global Director, Clinical Distribution Services, Catalent Pharma Solutions.
Welcome to the DIA 2016 annual conference.
Hi, thank you, Taryn. I'm glad to be here.
Talk to us about Catalent's launch of the new model and product called Fast Chain Demand-Led Supply, and what has prompted the need for this new supply model.
So, Taryn, the first thing is that the Fast Chain launch provides us with a more patient-centric focus into delivery of clinical supplies to our patients. So there's a lot of discussions, a lot of talk around the industry about having a more patient-centric experience with clinical trials, and Catalent has applied this to the clinical trial services and delivery of drugs to clinical sites. So that was one of the first aspects that enabled us to launch this new service. There's also a lot of factors that are happening out in the industry that's prompting us to have a new model. So if you look at some of the data that's out there, you'll see that clinical trials are becoming much more expensive, they're becoming more global in nature, and they're becoming much more complex. So, and if you think about it, like as an example, there's some data that's been recently presented by Tufts University that talks about the number of investigators, how they're becoming more global and how they're going into areas like remote areas, rest of the world, where there's now actually more investigators in the rest of the world than there are in Western Europe. So we've seen a real explosion of the global nature of these clinical trials, and we need to have a model that can more efficiently and effectively reach the clinical sites throughout the globe.
What are some of the benefits to using a demand-led approach?
So, Taryn, as I said earlier, one of the advantages, the first advantage is it's a very patient-centric approach to distribution of clinical trials. So we do have the clinical trial materials are closer to the patient to begin with. And so what that does is that enables the clinical trial material to be distributed much more quickly to a site. So that is certainly a pretty big advantage. The other advantage that this model has is for the pooling of clinical supplies. So these clinical trial materials are often very expensive to be able to produce, and there's a lot of wastage involved with this. So we're able to pool the supplies, and because we have the unlabeled primary pack material, we can distribute that material based on where the demand is. So there's a lot less wastage. So I think that is a major benefit. We've actually seen companies where a typical wastage factor can be up to 200%, see drastic reduction down to like around 20% of wastage. So that is very, very significant. I think the other advantages that demand-led supply model offer is if you think about the comparator purchases, for example, because we're packaging based on the clinic's demand, there's a lot less wastage, and you need actually a lot less comparative purchase. And the comparators, particularly since there's a significant amount of biologics under development right now, those are often very, very expensive. So this demand-led model helps to eliminate some of those costs. Another key advantage is around booklet labels. So the booklet labels are something that's very expensive, not very patient-centric either, and because we are distributing to specific countries, we don't need to rely on the booklet labels. So that is a huge savings for our clients, and as well, as I stated, it's much more patient-centric because now your patients don't have to be sitting there flipping through a bunch of labels to be able to understand their one language.
How is the fast chain demand-led supply approach different from the way clinical supplies have traditionally been managed?
Yeah, so if you think about the traditional model of a clinical supply, you typically have you do the primary packaging runs, and then those go into the secondary packaging runs, and then those go and they sit on a shelf, waiting for a site to call up and for the delivery for that product to get to the clinician's office. So if you think about that, there's a lot of time, there's a lot of wastage in that with the clinical trial material being just sitting around, and there's a lot of waste involved with that. So what this model is, it's a new model where what we're doing is getting drug product closer to the patients. And the way we're doing that is we're decoupling the primary packaging from the secondary packaging. So in this model, what we're doing is we're taking unlabeled primary pack material, and we'll send that material out to regional hubs throughout the globe, regional GMP facilities throughout the globe, and they'll sit there in those facilities until a site actually calls the demand for it, where we'll go ahead and we will do the packaging, the labeling, distribution in significantly reduced time. So again, this is also a much more patient-centric model because the clinical trial material is starting out closer to the patient to begin with. So a lot of efficiencies in this, a lot of reduced wastage as well.
What adjustments need to be made to the supply chain to adopt the demand-led approach, and what are some of the challenges?
So in terms of some of the changes, so as I had said earlier, we need to be able to have regional distribution capabilities, so GMP facilities spread throughout the globe, so not just the regular depots. So these are GMP facilities that can have the capability to do the packaging and the distribution out to the clinical sites. Now, some of the challenges with implementing this is since this is a very new model, it's a different way for a clinical trial approach. There's actually three areas I would say that are challenging. The first thing is a cultural change. So a lot of the pharmaceutical clients, they're used to having their own practice under a traditional method, and this requires a very different approach towards the clinical trial delivery. And that's where the cultural change comes into play, because the clients need to come up with a very different approach and processes for the development, packaging, labeling, and distribution of their drug product. So the other challenge that they would face is from a technical perspective, because to implement a demand-led services model requires the integration of a lot of systems, from making sure that it's forecasting demand correctly into the IVR systems, the IT systems, inventory management systems. So those have to be integrated with a client. So while the benefits are great once this is done, does take a little bit of time to get that set up. And then I would also say the third challenge to implementing this service effectively is actually from a quality perspective. And there's very different quality processes that have to be employed in terms of the release of product. And so, as I said earlier, it is a different approach, and in terms of getting supply out to clinics, so it does require different processes with the client, and that's sometimes challenging, particularly since the QA has a very rigid set of process, and trying to adopt those to a different model can somewhat be challenging.
It sounds like this demand-led supply model isn't something that a clinical sponsor could build and implement themselves, or is it?
Well, it is something that they could do on their own. They could try to, and actually some companies are trying to do that. I guess part of the challenge here is a lot of companies currently have a very centralized approach in terms of their clinical supply and how they do the distribution. And what this actually requires is having GMP facilities in very different regions of the world, and that's very difficult for one company to do. And it's for us to do it effectively, you have to be able to have that global presence. You also have to have the ability to integrate effectively with partners. So we do have one of the partners with whom we're implementing this from a logistics side is Markin, and we've taken a lot of time to make sure that we have very streamlined processes with them from a distribution perspective to make sure we have it done effectively. So while it's possible to do for people to implement, or for clients to implement, or for companies to implement this on their own, there's quite extensive challenges.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Taryn. I appreciate your time.
For more information on this topic, visit our Thought Leaders website.
For more Editors Take videos from the DIA Annual Conference, visit www.pharmavoice.com. Thanks for joining us.